Welcome to another edition of Talking Wild Madness. This is Adam, and today we're in a very nice space at the moment because we are celebrating the 10th episode of Talking Wild Madness. And although I'm hoping to one day look back in retrospect and think 10 episodes, come on, but I'm very grateful to have 10 episodes in, and I'm also very grateful to have had such lovely response since starting. We are up to nearly 200 plays. We're approaching 200 plays. I think we're on 186 at the moment. And again, even though that might seem like a very small number, it's wonderful. It's 185 more than I thought we'd have. So yeah, just super grateful. And just before I was going to start today, I found myself under pressure, under this weird kind of pressure, because there's been a few moments in the podcast that have come before that people have really responded to, and it's like, oh, I really liked when you said that, or I really liked when you were talking about this, I enjoyed this perspective on that. And then I got this sense of, oh, I have to make sure that these are very meaningful going forward, and I have to make sure that these are, profound going forward. And in an effort to completely get away from that kind of thinking, I just thought I'd jump in and just record episode 10. And even though it's a milestone in my head, it's not to make too much of a ceremony about it. There's going to be a song played every 10 episodes. So every time we get to episode 10, 20, 30, etc., I'll put a song on the end of each episode, just to celebrate the occasion. Or if someone gets on the Anchor website, Anchor is in ship's Anchor, podcast Anchor, you can look up Talking Wild Madness. That's how it gets made. And you can leave a voice message. So if you would like to leave a voice message on the Anchor.com podcast, obviously type in Talking Wild Madness, so you're not leaving a voice message on someone else's podcast. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but if you're trying to connect on through here, Talking Wild Madness at Anchor.com. Oh, sorry, not at Anchor.com, not like a website or an email, but it's on the Anchor website, and you can leave a voice message. You can comment, add suggestions, criticisms. You can sing a song. Actually, that'd be really nice. Instead of listening to my songs or Tom's songs, we could listen to one of your songs. That might be a nice way to do it. But anyway, at the, episode 10, 20, 30, 40, etc., there's going to be a song of some sort. So yeah, very excited, very grateful, and very happy to be able to live in a world and a time where you're able to make something and put it out immediately and connect with people and have some nice feedback. Not just nice feedback, really, really good feedback that's making an impact on my life, and it seems to be making a small impact on other people as well. So it's really a beautiful thing. And today, as well as the celebration, the 10th episode, what's that called? I don't think they even have a number, a name for 10, do they? Obviously, it's not like a decade. A decadial? No, couldn't be. I wonder what that is. It's like your 50 is a diamond or something, or a golden jubilee, or... we should look that up. We'll look that up for 20. There must be one for 20. But on a more somber note, we're going to use episode 10 to think about a mouse. We're actually going to be thinking about two different mice that have come across my world, my life in the last couple of weeks. And one was a mouse that I saw in Midland, and I was driving from the UWA campus in Perth, which is in Crawley, which is by the river. And if you listened to, I think it was podcast 6, there were loads of birds and ducks and peacocks and tremendous 100-year-old trees and manicured lawns. You can actually see pictures of it on the Instagram page. Put up a few pictures of UWA campus, and that's Adam Morris, author, on Instagram. Or you can just Google UWA and see the grounds. They're absolutely incredible. And Perth is a hot city. It's a dry, windy, dusty city, and it rains heavily maybe 2 months of the year, and the rest of the time it's a pretty dry landscape, except for the areas around the river. So the areas around the river are like they're like Egypt with the Nile. The areas around the river in Perth are as fecund as the farms on either side of the banks of the Nile in Egypt. So as I was driving back, and John lives in the hills. I hope he doesn't mind me saying so, but from Crawley by the river in Perth, you drive through Midland, and then you go up into the hills. And before you get to Midland, you go through, Kelmscott, I think, and you go through Perth City itself, and you go through about 4 different landscapes. Yeah, you leave the majesty, the fertile majesty of the river, and then you go into the urban, what the American audience would call the downtown area of the CBD, and then you go through the Graham Farmer freeway tunnel, which was named after an Aboriginal football player who was an amazing football player, an Australian rules football player. And then you head out into this, the Great Eastern Highway bypass, and you go onto Tonkin Highway, and you go onto Roe Highway. And Roe Highway, and these are dusty, horrendous freeways. These are like something. I imagine, I haven't been to Texas in the 1950s and 60s, but I imagine the freeways in Texas, maybe in East Texas, where it's even drier and it's even more barren and dusty. That's what Perth has. Now, Perth has got the fancy slick freeways, but it also has these relics that kind of feed the outer areas of the city and the industrial workings of the city into the slick freeways, and they have these miserable roadways called Tonkin Highway and Roe Highway. And then that leads to Midland. And Midland, oh my Lord, how to even describe Midland. Midland used to be a purely industrial area, and it used to be a railway hub, and it used to have all the railway work sheds where all the train carriages would be looked after. So it was where all the immigrants who came to Australia in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, all the tradesmen, all the mechanics, the carpenters, the upholsterers, all the engineers, all the the Italian guys, the Romanian guys, the English guys, the Irish guys, the Scottish guys, the guys who all left school when they were 14. and ended up looking for work somewhere, and they ended up getting work in these rail yards, looking after all the Midland, the rail system, and it stayed like that for decades. It stayed like that probably really up until I think 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So it's been an ugly spot. Now it's got really nice history to it, but with most really nice history, it's nice to look back. It's nice to flip through a glossy coffee table book with black and white or yellow and black pictures of, miserable looking, hardworking, strained men. It's not actually nice to be there. And if you've worked in one of those kind of jobs, you know exactly what I mean. So Midland has been a little bit like that teacher that we talked about, I think, in episode, I'm losing track of the episodes. Isn't that lovely? It's lovely to lose track of the episodes. But that teacher who had been thinking ugly thoughts for so long, who became ugly, and it was very difficult for her to come out of that space. And that's kind of what Midland, that's what Midland has been. It's been ugly for too long, almost. It's had absolutely no interest in aesthetics whatsoever. It was a very utilitarian area where the idea, it was basically based around maintenance, the maintaining of the railway system, and that's all Midland was. And it was also set in the flatlands of Perth just before it reached the hills, so it was incredibly dry, it was incredibly flat, and it was a place of maintenance. It was a place of work, and not glamorous work, just work. And it was full of mainly immigrant workers, and it was full of people who had left their education in order to survive, in order to get a job. But it was also full mainly of immigrants, and immigrants are special people. And my parents are immigrants. Immigrants are the people that have that gene in them that say, no, I'm not going to stay here. I'm gonna go over the mountain. I'm gonna go over there into the unknown, because maybe it's better. I'm gonna give that a go. And I heard someone talk about that gene that's in that immigrant gene is the same gene that people who struggle with addictions have. The drug addict and the immigrant are very, very similar because they're willing to take the risks. They're willing to go over the mountain, so to speak. Which I thought was very interesting. But I was driving through Midland anyway, and it's still, to say it has the echoes of its past would be inaccurate, because an echo would suggest that the past has come and gone, but the past is still right there. And there are massive parts of Midland that are still very much industrial shitholes. More of it than not. And I was driving through the back of Midland, and in the middle of the wreckers' yards, and the shut down glazier shops, and the 15th petrol station with huge diesel pumps for all the trucks that blast through it. There's the odd Chinese massage parlor, which is a fancy word for a brothel, in these scabby, dry, dusty, piss brown sand, drying leaves, just gross. And on that day there was a wind whipping through the place. And Perth, because Perth has a reputation as being the second windiest city in the world after Chicago. I've never been to Chicago, so I wouldn't know. I wonder if that's true though. because I've lived in Perth for a lot of years, and I have to say, I wouldn't say windy would be the first thing that came to mind. But regardless, on this particular afternoon, and it was just after I had left the paradise of UWA by the river, and I'd been surrounded with what sounded like macaws and peacocks and ducks, and now I was in this industrial flatland, this Mad Max landscape that had the odd traffic light in there, and it was at one of these traffic lights that I stopped, and in front of the car, going from it was a traffic light that was set underneath the bridge of Roe Highway. It's interesting naming a freeway after fish eggs, isn't it? It's very interesting. But I was underneath Roe Highway, and there was this little mouse, and he was the same piss brown color as the rest of Midland. He was like one of those butterflies in the Industrial Revolution that used to be white, but then after a decade of Manchester soot, the entire species of that butterfly had changed black, had become black to fit in with their environment. So this mouse, and who knew what color he was before, or who knew what color his ancestors were before he arrived in the state that he was. But he left there was like small bushes and tufts of grass in the around the pylon of Roe Highway, and it was as if he was waiting for the traffic lights as well, because as soon as I stopped, then he jumped out on the road and crossed the road to go to the other side of the road. So you have this urban mouse, this industrial blue-collar mouse who had adapted so well to the city that he's actually waiting for traffic lights. Unbelievable. And the first thing that I thought when I saw him, because it was hot, it was windy, and I think it was over 30 degrees that day, and it would have been the time of day where it would have been peaking, it would have been close to 30. And this little mouse, like when you're in a normal car and you're driving around in that industrial zone, and there's 18-wheeler trucks passing you by on every side, like, you feel small, even if you're in a nice car, in a strong car, you feel intimidated in that traffic. And I was wondering how small that mouse must have felt. And he kind of bounced along. He just bounced along the road, ripped across it, and then he was up on the other curb. He was up on the curb, and then I lost him in the dead grass on the other side of the road, because he was the same color. He was camouflaged, and then I lost him. But I thought to myself, as the lights changed to green and I went right under Roe Highway, I thought, I wonder if he knows about the river. I wonder if he knows that he doesn't have to live here in Midland. Now, there's a lot of assumptions going on there. First of all, I'm assuming that he lives in Midland, that that's where he is. Now, he might have been passing through Midland the way I was passing through Midland, and he might have looked at me and thought, what's that fella doing living here in Midland? So, I mean, obviously I can't speak for the mouse and what he thought of me, but I should temper my judgments on that mouse, because maybe he doesn't live in Midland, and maybe he was crossing that street thinking exactly the same thing I was thinking, or maybe he was on the way to the Chinese massage parlor. But I did wonder if he was aware that he didn't have to live there, that he didn't have to stay in one spot, that there were options available to him outside of his present reality, that he could go over the mountain if he wanted to. And then I wondered if he knew that there was a mountain that he could go over. And then I wondered if he did think that there was a mountain that he could go over, I wonder what he imagined was on the other side. And then the other assumption I'm making is that he didn't enjoy Midland, because maybe he loved it. Maybe he loved the hustle and bustle of the industrial area. Maybe he loved the history of the rail yards. Maybe he loved the immigrant story of Midland. Maybe he loved being the same color as his environment. Maybe he loved being able to just disappear like Batman with a plume of smoke, except he didn't need the plume of smoke or the utility belt or whatever. So there are a lot of assumptions there. And I guess I was putting myself in the mouse's perspective and thinking, if I was that mouse, I think I'd like to live down by the river. But then again, there's probably maybe down by the river is not a great place for a mouse. And maybe when I'm sitting by the river, surrounded by peacocks and ducks and all kinds of birds I can't even see or recognize when I do see them, maybe that's not the best place for the mouse. Or maybe there's less snakes in Midland than there are by the river. Or maybe the mouse knows exactly where the river is, and maybe the mouse is very, very happy in Midland. But the second mouse that came across my path, I suppose, more my mental path, not my physical path. And I suppose there's an argument there for those two things perhaps being the same thing to some degree, was a suicidal mouse, or at least a potential suicidal mouse. Now, the first ever suicidal mouse that I came across, or that I can remember coming across in my life, was a cartoon mouse, and this was when I was a kid. This was when I can't remember exactly, but I think I was about 6 years old, maybe 5 or 6 or 7. I remember sitting, and this could be a completely warped memory, but I remember there's all sorts of things going on in this place at the moment. So we've got a lot of background noise today. We've got 3 young men upstairs who are doing a science project, and occasionally they make a hell of a lot of noise, and occasionally they don't. But I think that's good. I think that's probably a good sign of good science. And then there's the ubiquitous Wilco, who randomly makes noise. Well, it appears it's random to me when he decides to make noise. But the memory I have of this suicidal mouse, the first suicidal mouse I ever saw, and this is a testament to the fact that this memory can't be true, because when I remember it, I can see myself sitting cross-legged, looking up at the TV screen, which is something you do as a kid, but it's not something that you would remember. So let me take myself out of this memory. But the first suicidal mouse that I saw was in a Warner Brothers cartoon. And I think he was in like New York Harbor. And it was the beginning of the cartoon. And it was a cartoon that had, it was a Sylvester and Tweety Bird cartoon. But it opened up, oh geez, they're making some noise out there. But it opened up, there was this mouse on one of the piers on New York Harbor, and he was looking into, well, what I can imagine would either be the Hudson or the East River. And he was staring into the water, and he had his hands in front of him in like a prayer position. and he was basically saying goodbye to the world. It was one of those goodbye, cruel world. I'm going to take my leave. And I remember thinking, and again, I don't know if I thought it at the time or if I'm thinking it in retrospect, but I remember thinking that is an incredibly dark opening to a children's cartoon. But that's what you got. You got that with those Warner Brother cartoons. You got that with the greed of Daffy Duck and the pettiness of Daffy Duck and the street smart of Bugs Bunny, and the ambition of Wile E. Coyote, and the sexual, the rampant sexual desire of the French skunk, and the rage and anger of who's the cowboy with the big huge moustache, Samity Sam. But I remember this mouse anyway, and I thought, man, that is incredibly, that's a strong opening. That's a strong opening to this story. Where's it going to go? But this week I came across what was possibly a real-life suicidal mouse. And this mouse has been posthumously named Ricky the mouse. And Ricky lived in my friend's house, and he was spotted sporadically. And it was just him. It was just one of him. So the place wasn't overrun with rodents. It just had Ricky bouncing around every now and then. And my friend has a very springy dog. And it's the kind of dog that's very alert and kind of moves like it's a big dog, but it moves like a cat. And it would pose a threat to this mouse, to Ricky, if it wanted to. And it would have half a chance of pouncing and catching the mouse, or giving the mouse a heart attack and killing it that way, just out of terror. Probably wouldn't work with the Midland mouse. If he did live there, it probably wouldn't be able to scare him too easily. I think he'd be Midland hard, and I think you'd have to, if you wanted to kill that fella, you'd have to do more than give him a heart attack. You'd have to do more than scare him. You'd have to get him. You'd have to put him down. Whereas Ricky, he was a small mouse. He wasn't. You wouldn't mistake him for a rat at all. He was very small. You might even think that he was a baby mouse if you first saw him. But because you saw him over and over again, there was a lot of sightings of Ricky. He was witnessed constantly, and he never grew. So he was either like an immortal baby, or maybe just a malnourished, underfed mouse. And the place where he lived, in fairness, it has to be said, is probably the equivalent of Midland here in Albany. He didn't live in a suburb of milk and honey, so to speak. And this morning I got a message. It was a photograph, and it was of Ricky floating in a big bucket of water. And it was quite a confronting sight. It was quite a confronting sight. Now, Ricky, as I said, was a very small mouse, and he'd probably be about, from nose to tail, maybe 5 centimeters. Maybe 5 centimeters, which I think is only 2 inches for our American audiences. So he was a small fella, and the bucket that he was in, floating, and it was almost like an operatic death. He was floating upside down, and his little paws were stretched out. He was upside down, and he was like prostrate, and his arms. He was like the guy that went over the river waterfall on a crucifix upside down in the movie The Mission, except he wasn't on a crucifix, and his feet paws. I don't know what the scientific name for a mouse's feet are. His paws, the equivalent of his feet paws, always through the perspective of the human, isn't it? That's telling. But his feet paws were prostrate and his little arm paws were prostrate. And at least that's the way it looked in the photo. At least that's the way it looked in the photo. And his head was right back. And the bucket that he was in was white. And he cast, it was a very dramatic, he cast like just an outline. It was like a shadow of a mouse. It was like a shadow of a mouse. And he was upside down, floating. Obviously, he was still because it was a photograph. But I would imagine in real life, he would have been just as still as he was in the photograph. And what was curious was the fact that he managed to get up this bucket, because there was nothing around the bucket that he could have climbed up onto and then leapt off into the bucket. And Albany is a place of rain. It's not a dry place. It's a moist town, for want of a better word. The town is moist. So Ricky may have been malnourished, but I don't think he would have been dehydrated. So, I mean, and they're really the only two options. Well, there's three options. He either fell into the bucket by accident, which really wouldn't make any sense because there was nothing around him to get onto. So he couldn't have fallen into the bucket. But in all the times that he had been sighted, he'd been sighted alone. And, you know, again, if you put your mind into the mouse who is undernourished, who is probably scared a lot of the time because he is so small and because he does live in an environment where he's constantly hunted or unwanted. So you have a mouse that's undernourished, and you have a mouse who lives in constant fear, and you have a mouse who is alone. And I think there's only so much of that. I was about to say there's only so much of that a human can take, but I think there's only so much of that any living creature can take, unless they love it. But I haven't met many things that love being malnourished, afraid, and alone. And I doubt Ricky was the exception. So I don't think he would have got into that bucket by accident, and I think the only two options that are really left, if we treated the deaths of mice with the same suspicion that we treated the deaths of humans, like if there was a mouse coroner and a mouse detective to cover this what had happened. And that's not to say that the detective has to be an actual mouse himself. Like it could be a human detective covering the death of the mouse. And then the coroner doesn't have to be a mouse himself. He could just be a human coroner who exclusively covered mouse deaths, mouse tragedies. What's the scientific word for it's rodent, isn't it? A rodent coroner. A rodent coroner. That almost sounds like that sounds like something out of Edgar Allan Poe or Charles Dickens. he was a rodent coroner, which who knows? Who knows what that would mean? But it wouldn't mean he was a mouse. That's not what it would mean. And if he was a mouse, if the detective was a mouse and the coroner was a mouse, would they be tiny coroners and tiny detectives who had like tiny notepads and tiny scalpels and tiny operating tables and tiny fridges? Or would they be like bipedal, 5.5 foot, 6 foot tall, giant mice in 3-piece suits who would just be fucking terrifying? My Lord. And then you'd be the one getting the heart attack when you wake up in the morning and there's a dead mouse on your floor or in your bucket of water, and then a 6-foot mouse in a 3-piece suit knocks at your front door and wants to ask you some hard questions. So the two questions that remain for Ricky is that he either wanted to get into that bucket. There's only really two reasons left, because the accident has been ruled out. So he either wanted to get in there because he was very thirsty or because he was very sad. And I don't know which one is worse. I don't know which one is more tragic. I don't know. I don't think it was because he was thirsty, because he lived in a moist town, and very close to the scene of his death are these wetlands. There are these swamps. I was going to say lakes, but they're not lakes. They're more like small swamps in parklands. But then thinking of that, those same swamps are constantly covered in swarms of birds. So I'm thinking, oh, you could get water there, Ricky. And probably the idea of even approaching such a space for Ricky would be, well, that would be probably suicide. Maybe, yeah, that would be terrifying. So if we rule out the fact that, or maybe we can't rule out the fact that he was thirsty. See, I could be a mouse detective. But if we were to rule it out and he was just sad, then the next thing to be considered would be the fact that he had to get up this bucket. Now, when I think of a bucket, I think of a bucket that Jack from Jack and the Beanstalk might find at the top of the beanstalk when he's in the giant's house. And the bucket in my head is a wooden bucket with like a steel casing around the outside of the old wooden bucket, and they might have some bolts and nails in it, like an old Cooper's barrel, like a Coopersmith's barrel, beer barrel, like a half one of those. And if it was one of those kind of buckets, then you would think, yeah, maybe the mouse, maybe a mouse could scamper up that, because there'd be enough texture and rough edges and gaps and splits in the wood for him to get his little paws in, to get a good purchase on the outside of the bucket, and he could scamper up. He could get to the rim. He could stare into what for him would be the dark abyss. He could say his little mouse prayers. He could farewell the world, and then he could let himself go. But the bucket that he was found in, upside down, laying prostrate, was a modern day plastic bucket. And it was, like I said, it was a white bucket. And as you know, if you've ever seen a modern day plastic bucket, they kind of ramp outwards ever so slightly, but they're smaller at the base than they are at the top, which means that Ricky would have had to, and there's no purchase points in these plastic bucket sides. There's nowhere There's no indentations. There's no difference in texture. It's just smooth 20th century plastic. So somehow Ricky would have had to have not only walked up, this bucket would have been 30 centimeters tall, or 1 foot for our American audiences. So he would have had to have, almost like Spider-Man, somehow crawled up the side of a smooth bucket that had an incline. Depending on which side of the triangle you're looking at, it would have been, what would his incline have been, like 80 degrees? So he would have had to have been, I mean, this is almost an impossible feat for a malnourished, terrified mouse. So you wonder, he either really was very, very thirsty and somehow was sticky enough to get himself up this bucket, or he really wanted to commit suicide. He didn't want to go and risk getting water at the swamp down the road because of the terrible death that he'd suffer at the claws and beak of the thousands of teeming birds that circle that swamp 24/7. So he either didn't want to do that and wanted the gentle, soft, quiet solitude death that drowning himself in the kitchen in the middle of the night in this bucket would have given him. Or there's a third option, is that it's very, very possible that Ricky may have been murdered.